Flames crackled on the firestones at the hall's two ends, their smoke mingling and churning in the soot-blackened roof space. There was no sign of Nimue. Wine, smoked fish, and oatcakes were served to the visitors. Then Bishop Bedwin made a speech, explaining to Norwenna that Gundlias, king of Siluria, while on a mission of friendship to the High King, had happened to be passing close to Innis Swydren, and had thought it courteous to pay this visit to the Prince Mordred and his mother. The king had brought the prince some gifts, Bedwin said, upon which Gundlias carelessly waved the gift-bearers forward. The two guards carried the chest to Norwenna's feet. The princess had not spoken, nor did she speak now, as the gifts were laid on the carpet at her feet. There was a fine wolf fur, 2 otter pelts, a beaver fur, and a hart's skin, a small gold torque, some brooches, a drinking horn wrapped in a silver wicker pattern, and a Roman flask of pale green glass, with a wonderfully delicate spout, and a handle shaped as a wreath. The empty chest was carried away, and there was an awkward silence in which no one quite knew what to say. Gundlias gestured carelessly at the gifts. Bishop Bedwin beamed happiness. Tanabers hawked a protective gobbet of spit at a pillar, while Norwenna looked dubiously at the king's gifts, which were not in truth over-generous. The hart's skin might make a fine pair of gloves. The pelts were good, though Norwenna probably had a score of better ones in her wicker baskets, while the torque around her neck was 4 times as heavy as the one lying at her feet. Gundlias's brooches were of thin gold, and the drinking horn was chipped at its rim. Only the green Roman flask was truly precious. Bedwin broke the embarrassing silence. "The gifts are magnificent, rare and magnificent. Truly generous, Lord King." Norwenna nodded obedient agreement. The child began to cry, and Ralla, the wet nurse, carried him off to the shadows beyond the pillars, where she bared a breast and so silenced him. "The Edling is well?" Gundlias spoke for the first time since entering the hall. "Praise God and his saints," Norwenna answered. "He is." "His left foot?" Gundlias asked untactfully. "Does it mend?" "His foot will not stop him from riding a horse, wielding a sword, or sitting upon a throne," Norwenna answered firmly. "Of course not. Of course not," Gundlias said, and glanced across at the hungry babe. He smiled, then stretched his long arms and looked about the hall. He had said nothing of marriage, but he would not in this company. If he wanted to marry Norwenna, then he would ask Uther, not Norwenna. This visit was merely an opportunity for him to inspect his bride. He spared Norwenna a brief, disinterested look, then gazed again about the shadowed hall. "So this is Lord Merlin's lair, Gundlias said. "Where is he?" No one answered. Tanabers was scrabbling beneath the edge of one of the carpets, and I guessed he was burying a charm in the earth of the hall floor. Later, when the Silurian delegation was gone, I searched the spot and found a small bone carving of a boar that I threw on the fire. The flames burned blue and spat fiercely, and Nimue said I had done the right thing. "Lord Merlin, we think, is in Ireland," Bishop Bedwin at last answered. "Or maybe in the northern wilderness," he added vaguely. "Or maybe dead," Gundlias suggested. "I pray not," the bishop said fervently. "You do?" Gundlias twisted in his chair to stare into Bedwin's aged face. "You approve of Merlin, Bishop?" "He is a friend, Lord King," Bedwin said. He was a dignified, plump man who was ever eager to keep the peace between the various religions. "Lord Merlin is a druid, Bishop, who hates Christians." Gundlias was trying to provoke Bedwin. "There are many Christians in Britain now," Bedwin said, "and few druids. I think we of the true faith have nothing to fear." "You hear that, Tanabers?" Gundlias called to his druid. "The bishop doesn't fear you." Tanabers did not answer. In his questing around the hall, he had come to the ghost fence that guarded the door to Merlin's chambers. The fence was a simple one, merely 2 skulls placed on either side of the door, but only a druid would dare cross their invisible barrier, and even a druid would fear a ghost fence placed by Merlin. "Will you rest here tonight?" Bishop Bedwin asked Gunlias, trying to change the subject away from Merlin. "No," Gunlias said rudely, rising. I thought he was about to take his leave, but instead he looked past Norwenna to the small, black, skull-guarded door in front of which Tanabers was quivering like a hound, smelling an unseen boar. "What's through the door?" the king asked. "My Lord Merlin's chambers, Lord King," Bedwin said. "The place of secrets?" Gunlias asked wolfishly. "Sleeping quarters, nothing more," Bedwin said dismissively. Tanabers raised his moon-tipped staff and held it quivering towards the ghost fence. King Gunlias watched his druid's performance, then drained his wine and tossed the drinking horn onto the floor. "Maybe I shall sleep here after all," the king said. "But first let us inspect the sleeping quarters." He waved Tanabers forward, but the druid was nervous. Merlin was the greatest druid in Britain, feared even beyond the Irish Sea, and no one meddled in his life lightly. Yet the great man had not been seen for many a long month, and some folk whispered that Prince Mordred's death had been a sign that Merlin's power was waning, and Tanabers, like his master, was surely fascinated by what lay behind the door, for secrets could lie there that would make Tanabers as mighty and learned as the great Merlin himself. "Open the door!" Gunlias ordered Tanabers. The butt of the moonstaff moved tremulously towards one of the skulls, hesitated, then touched the yellowing bone dome. Nothing happened. Tanabers spat on the skull, then tipped it over before snatching his staff back like a man who has prodded a sleeping snake. Again, nothing happened, and so he reached his free hand towards the door's wooden latch. Then he stopped in terror. A howl had echoed in the hall's smoking dark, a ghastly screech, like a girl being tortured, and the awful sound drove the druid back. Norwenna cried aloud with fear, and made the sign of the cross. The baby Mordred began wailing, and nothing Ralla could do would quiet him. Gunlias first checked at the noise, then laughed as the howl faded. "A warrior," he announced to the nervous hall. "He's not frightened of a girl's scream." He walked towards the door, ignoring Bishop Bedwin, who was fluttering his hands as he tried to restrain the king without actually touching him. A crash sounded from the ghost-guarded door. It was a violent splintering noise, and so sudden that everyone jumped with alarm. At first I thought the door had fallen before the king's advance. Then I saw that a spear had been thrust clean through it. The silver-coloured spearhead stood proud of the old fire-blackened oak, and I tried to imagine what inhuman force had been needed to drive that sharpened steel through so thick a barrier. The spear's sudden appearance made even Gunlias check, but his pride was threatened, and he would not back down in the face of his warriors. He made the sign against evil, spat at the spearhead, then walked to the door, lifted its latch and pushed it open, and immediately stepped back with horror on his face. I was watching him, and I saw the raw fear in his eyes. He took a second pace away from the open door. Then I heard Nimue's keening cry as she advanced into the hall. Tanabers was making urgent motions with his staff. Bedwin was praying. The baby was crying, while Norwenna had turned in her chair with a look of anguish. Nimue came through the door, and, seeing my friend, even I shivered. She was naked, and her thin white body was raddled with blood that had dripped down from her hair to run in rivulets past her small breasts and on to her thighs. Her head was crowned with a death mask, the tanned face skin of a sacrificed man that was perched above her own face like a snarling helmet, and held in place by the skin of the dead man's arms, knotted about her thin neck. The mask seemed to have a dreadful life of its own, for it twitched as she walked towards the Silurian king. The dead man's dry and yellow body skin hung loose down Numui's back as she stuttered forward in small, irregular steps. Only the whites of her eyes were showing in her bloody face, and as she twitched forward, she called out imprecations in a language fouler than any soldier's tongue, while in her hands were two vipers, their dark bodies gleaming and their flickering heads questing towards the king. Gundlias retreated, making the sign against evil. Then he remembered that he was a man, a king and a warrior, and so he put his hand on his sword hilt. It was then that Nimue jerked her head, and the death mask fell back from her hair that was piled high on her scalp. Then we all saw that it was not her hair that was piled there, but a bat that suddenly stretched its black crinkling wings and snarled its red mouth at Gundlias. The bat made Norwenna scream and run to fetch her baby, while the rest of us stared in horror at the creature, which was trapped in Nimue's hair. It jerked and flapped, tried to fly, snarled and struggled. The snakes twisted, and suddenly the hall emptied. Norwenna ran first, Tanabers followed, then everyone, even the king, was running for the morning daylight at the eastern door. Nimue stood motionless as they fled. Then her eyes rolled and she blinked. She walked to the fire and carelessly tossed the two snakes into the flames, where they hissed, whiplashed, then sizzled as they died. She freed the bat, which flew up into the rafters, then untied the death mask from around her neck and rolled it into a bundle before picking up the delicate Roman flask from among the gifts that Gundlias had brought. She stared at the flask for a few seconds. Then her wiry body twisted as she hurled the treasure against an oak pillar, where it shattered into a scatter of pale green shards. "Derval!" she snapped into the sudden silence that followed. "I know you're here." "Nimue?" I said nervously, then stood up from behind my wicker screen. I was terrified. Snake fat was hissing in the fire, and the bat was rustling in the roof. Nimue smiled at me. "I need water, Derval," she said. "Water?" I asked stupidly. "To wash off the chicken blood," Nimue explained. "Chicken?" "Water," she said again. "There's a jar by the door. Bring some." "In there?" I asked, astonished because her gesture seemed to imply that I should bring the water into Merlin's rooms. "Why not?" she asked, then walked through the door that was still impaled with the great boar spear, while I lifted the heavy jar and followed to find her standing in front of a sheet of beaten copper that reflected her nude body. She was unembarrassed, perhaps because we had all run naked as children, but I was uncomfortably aware that the two of us were children no longer. "Here?" I asked. Nimue nodded. I put the jar down and backed towards the door. "Stay," she said. "Please stay. And shut the door." I had to prise the spear out of the door before I could close it. I did not like to ask how she had driven that spearhead through the oak, for she was in no mood for questions. So I stayed silent as I worked the weapon free, and Nimue washed the blood off her white skin, then wrapped herself in a black cloak. "Come here," she said, when she had finished. I crossed obediently to a bed of furs and woolen blankets that was piled on a low wooden platform, where she evidently slept at nights. The bed was tented with a dark, musty cloth, and in its darkness I sat and cradled her in my arms. I could feel her ribs through the cloak's woolen softness. She was crying. I did not know why, so I just held her clumsily and stared about Merlin's room. It was an extraordinary place. There were scores of wooden chests and wicker baskets piled up to make nooks and corridors, through which a tribe of skinny kittens stalked.